Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to just be thinking about the evolution of the string quartet. And just in case this kind of string quartet formula isn't immediately familiar to you, we've got a score of the opening page of a string quartet written by Haydn, his Opus 64 number 5 in D major, that's sometimes known as the Lark. Other people know it as the hornpipe. I think the Lark is a more common nickname for it. It's funny how a lot of these pieces were given these nicknames. So this one's the Lark. And you can see how the score is laid out. The first thing to be aware of is that when we're talking about a string quartet, we're not talking about violin, viola, cello and double bass. A lot of people sort of think that's what a string quartet is. You'll notice on this score, we've actually got two violin parts. So violin 1 and violin 2. So two violinists playing separate parts. Then we have a viola, and then at the bottom we have the cello, given its full title here, the violoncello. You'll notice that obviously the violins are reading in the treble clef and the cello's reading in the bass clef, which is what you might expect. The viola is reading in the alto clef. Now the viola is the only instrument that really spends nearly all of its life reading in the alto clef. When the viola goes high, it sometimes slips into treble clef, but most of the time the default position anyway is the alto clef. So if you're not quite sure what an alto clef is, well, that's what it looks like. And in the alto clef, middle C is on the middle line of the stave. The third line up from the bottom of the stave is where middle C is. So, getting familiar a little bit with how the alto clef works is useful if you're trying to see what's happening in a string quartet. Well, the string quartet as a kind of musical medium is something that's very much a classical period innovation. So what are we talking about in terms of years? Well, the classical period followed the Baroque period. Bach died in 1750, a great master of the Baroque period. And so because he died, Handel died just a few years later as well. New things were already starting to happen. And so from 1750 onwards, we are in the classical period. When the classical period ends is something that not everybody fully kind of concurs on, but not earlier than 1810, not later than 1830, but somewhere in that window is where the classical period comes to an end and the Romantic period begins. So you've got this reasonably narrow window that is the classical period. So we often talk about classical music, which is a generic term talking about the whole history of a certain kind of Western music, if you like, but the classical period very specifically starting in 1750. So this string quartet is really a classical period innovation. But of course, it didn't just suddenly appear from nowhere. Haydn is the composer who's often associated with really getting the string quartet established. So that's why we're looking at a page of a Haydn quartet here. But really, it didn't come from nowhere. There were lesser known composers around, people like Wagenseil. Ever heard of him? No? Well, he'd written pieces of music for solo violins, for viola and cello. There'd been a long tradition of performing orchestral works where you just have one instrument playing each part, even in the string section. So that's sort of not unlike a string quartet. Obviously, the double bass, as we've already said, doesn't belong to the string quartet. It wasn't really part of the orchestra either until the 19th century. So you really had a sort of string quartet as the string section of the orchestra. So all of that was kind of coming ahead of the quartet. And if in the orchestra you just had one string player to a part, well, you might have had some other instruments thrown at it as well, and you might have had a keyboard player playing the harpsichord, and that would have been what we call the basso continuo, things like this. But really, we've got the kind of bare bones of what could develop into a string quartet quite easily. Now, these orchestral composers from before the classical period were not really showing any interest in writing string quartets as a kind of medium of its own, but they were doing things that possibly led in the direction of the birth of the string quartet proper, if you like. We might also think about the fact that the string quartet of the classical period perhaps has a little bit of history in something called the Baroque trio sonata. Now, trio, that sort of suggests three people, doesn't it? So what you had in a Baroque trio sonata were two solo instruments, two violins, two oboes, two flutes, something like that. And they performed with this keyboard player, the harpsichordist, doing what was called the continuo, which meant that the harpsichordist would play the keyboard part and a cello would double up the bass line with the keyboard part. Now, if you were in church, sometimes it was the organ that played the keyboard part, sometimes it was the bassoon that played the bass line. But these trio sonatas, the idea of two instruments and a bass instrument with a keyboard, not miles away from a possible development into the string quartet. Again, they're not string quartets, but it's part of the history of evolution, if you like. We also had a few sonatas in the Baroque period that were written for four-part string ensembles. So you get things like that written by composers like Allegri. And so they're sort of verging on almost being a string quartet. And certainly by the early 18th century, we had composers adding a third soloist, starting to leave out the keyboard part, leaving the cello to play the bass line on its own. And so we've got composers like Alessandro Scarlatti, who wrote a set of 6 pieces that were kind of sonatas for 4 instruments. And he was writing for 2 violins, a viola and a cello, no harpsichord. Well, what's that? It sounds to us as if it was a string quartet. So even though we're saying that the string quartet was really a classical period innovation, I'm hoping I'm beginning to help you see that there were things going on in the Baroque period that were kind of pointing in this direction, kind of leading to a point where composers like Haydn came along and said, hey, you know what, this string quartet idea is quite a good one. And it becomes a real kind of centerpiece thing for the classical period. I mean, classical period composers start writing symphonies, they start writing string quartets, and these are some of the really main things that are going on at that time. So from the 1750s, it's Haydn who really establishes the quartet as an ensemble for 4 equal partners. Now, I think that's an important thing. It's not just like, you know, we've got some solo instruments upstairs, then we've got somebody playing the bass line, but now we're thinking about these 4 instruments, the 2 violins, the viola and the cello, as 4 independent players inside an ensemble that really becomes established as the string quartet. And Haydn, who's often called the father of the symphony, because he wrote so many symphonies, 104 symphonies, goodness me. But actually, in my opinion, he could easily have been entitled the father of the string quartet as well. Well, certainly since Haydn, the string quartet has never looked back. His famous contemporary Mozart also wrote string quartets. Closely followed by Beethoven. He kept writing string quartets, loved it. Schubert, another composer around at the same time as Beethoven, also loved writing string quartets. So by the time we got there, this string quartet had really taken off as a new thing. And then during the Romantic period, we've got lots of famous composers writing string quartets like Mendelssohn, Schumann, Brahms. Then we move on to people like Dvorak and Janacek and Debussy and many other fine composers into the 20th century. So once we got going in the classical period, the string quartet was here to stay. There was, if we're honest about this, a slight lull in string quartet writing Later in the 19th century, composers got kind of diverted into other things, writing these huge scale pieces with big orchestras, big operas, all that kind of stuff. Maybe the string quartet didn't quite fit with that, but there was just a temporary lull in activity in the string quartet writing before the 20th century saw a huge kind of revival. So we have a group of composers called the Second Viennese School in the 20th century. Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, those are the three composers of the Second Viennese School. They get involved in quartets. Bartók does, Shostakovich. More recently, Milton Babbitt, Elliot Carter. So it goes on. I mean, we could compile a huge list of 20th century composers. So one thing that's interesting about the string quartet is we've got this kind of Baroque background we've talked about. We see how it becomes a real innovation in the classical period, but then we see how it hangs around. And despite that slight lull in the 19th century, it's very much around again in the 20th century. So it becomes a very popular medium for composers. And it's amazing, just these four parts for strings, how flexible they are. They're very agile instruments. They can fly around all over the place very quickly. They can do lots of different things. They can play with the bow, that's called arco. You can pluck the strings, that's called pizzicato. There are lots of other playing techniques. They're really good with dynamics. They've got a lovely wide range. So, I mean, it's a really kind of agile set of instruments that you can do so much with and create so many different colours with. Now, when it came to kind of putting the piece together, the string quartet structure, the classical period structure was really to have four movements. Not all of them are in four movements, but that was basically how it worked. The first movement was in something called sonata form, and that's another really key principle in the classical period. So you really put all the weight on the first movement. And then you maybe have a slow movement that's sort of contrasting in a related key. Then you have a little sort of dancey bit to follow called the minuet and trio. And then you often have a fourth movement that's in what's called rondo form, or sometimes sonata rondo form. But that's a more light-hearted movement. So the weight's on the first movement, you have a kind of light-hearted finish, then you have a slow movement, then this minuet and trio. The rondo, last movement, way that works is you have what we call the main theme, the A theme, that keeps coming back. So you go A, then you contrast with a B idea. Then you come back to A. Then maybe you go to C, another new idea, and then you come back to A. So you get really familiar with the A theme that keeps coming round. The first movement, as I say, was in this thing called sonata form. That's got three sections. It's got an exposition, a development, and a recapitulation. And in the exposition, you have two subjects. So often you have the first subject, which is the first main tune, if you like, in the tonic key. And then you have a second subject a bit later on in the dominant key. And then all of that comes to an end and you have a repeat sign and you repeat all of that exposition over and over again. Sorry, not over and over, just repeat it once. And then you get something called the development section. And as the name suggests, you're developing the ideas that you first heard in the exposition. And then you come eventually to a final section called the recapitulation. And then you revisit the themes from the exposition, the first subject and the second subject. But this time, both of them are in the tonic key. So in the exposition, the first subject was in the tonic key. The second subject was normally in the dominant key, a fifth higher. But in the recapitulation, the first and the second subjects are both in the tonic key because you want the movement to finish in the tonic key, not in the dominant key. So that was a very standard classical period form, not just in string quartets, but in sonatas for instruments, in the first movement of symphonies. It's sometimes called first movement form. So that's what's going on in a classical string quartet. Well, Haydn certainly was the master of it. He wrote 68 string quartets, if you don't mind. Mozart wrote fewer, but they're wonderful works. He wrote 23 of them. There was another guy around called Boccherini. He managed to write 91, so he well exceeded Haydn. Beethoven wrote some real quality quartets, fewer in number. He wrote 16, but they're real quality stuff. String quartet wasn't any kind of sideline activity, because these composers were absolutely mainstream composers, and they're definitely establishing the string quartet for the long term. Now, the great thing is to try and get out there and have a listen to some of these quartets, so you've got an idea what they sound like. So we've talked about Haydn and we've talked about Mozart, so definitely worth seeing if you can hear some of their quartets, maybe even have a look at some of their scores. Definitely have a look at Beethoven and Schubert and Mendelssohn and Schumann we mentioned. Have a look at Brahms, have a look at Dvorak, think about Debussy, think about Bartók, maybe Webern from the Second Viennese School, Shostakovich, get a bit of a Russian flavour from the 20th century. What about some other quartets in slightly different traditions? Villa-Lobos, for example, or Philip Glass, or Stockhausen. Stockhausen wrote a very interesting string quartet called the Helicopter String Quartet, where you've got the 4 string players, each in their own helicopter, flying around trying to play the quartet with each other. So that's a bit novel, isn't it? But just to go back to Haydn, who really got the quartet going, let's just have a quick look at the Lark Quartet. Now you can see, we've already talked about, we've got these 4 instruments, the 2 violin parts, the viola and the cello, and you've got that viola reading in the alto clef. Well, let's see what Haydn does in this particular quartet, just to give you a flavour of it. It starts off with these staccato notes in violin 2 and viola, and then the cello kind of copies them. So we get a group of staccato notes in these 2 instruments, and then the cello kind of mimics that staccato thing. And then these 2 players come back and duet them again. And then you get the cello doing it again. And then these 2 players are back doing it again. But this time we get some kind of bass notes. So that's really what's happening in the introduction, which goes something like this. Obviously you're hearing this being played on a piano sound, so it's the wrong sound. You want to hear it with the string instruments to get the full impact. But it's just giving you an idea as to how Haydn went about writing one of his quartets. Now, the next thing that happens is the first violin comes in, and this is the first subject. Remember, I was talking about these subjects. It's the first tune, and it's in D major, which is the home key, the tonic key, and this melody goes like this. And so it goes on to the next page. So you can hear what's happening with that. Well, while the violin is playing that melody, what are the other parts doing? Well, look, we're kind of redoing this stuff again. You see, that's come from here, isn't it? And then the cello is kind of redoing this thing that comes from there. And then the second violin and the viola are kind of redoing this thing. And then the cello is doing something slightly different from what happened there, but it's a similar idea. And then these 2 come in again, and then the cello comes in again. So you see how those ideas from the introduction get used. So a string quartet isn't really 4 players all playing notes at the same time as each other. It might be that some of the time, but you can see how varied you can make the texture. So when that first violin comes in with a tune, let me see if I can give you a flavour of this. It's not entirely easy to play all this on the piano because you haven't got enough fingers or hands to do it, but I'll give you the idea. You see how that's going. So that's the first page of this. And then as we go on to the second page, you can kind of see what's happening here, that we've got that melody just continuing in the first violin. But all the time, all this stuff is still going on underneath. You see all this staccato stuff. But once Haydn's done enough of that, we come on to the second line, and suddenly it's all going a bit more legato, isn't it? And then... and on we go. You get the idea as to how this piece works. So just to give you a flavour of the history of the string quartet, and just to begin to get us into a quartet by Haydn. So just the opening of that first movement by Haydn of the Lark quartet. So that's a fairly kind of brief potted history of the string quartet, but I hope it's just enough to get you into it, and then you might feel that you want to really go and listen to the music. I mean, you can do lots of reading about the history of the string quartet, and that's very interesting if you're studying all this. The main thing is get into the music and see what's going on there. And if you're a composer, well, have a look at some of these ideas and think, maybe I could write a string quartet. It's a great thing to do, and you'll be amazed at what you can achieve in terms of so much musical colour and variety through writing for the string quartet. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, you might like to go to the Music Matters website to see what else is there that might be useful to you. www.mmcourses.co.uk. If you click on courses there, you'll find lots of courses about all sorts of different things: theory, analysis, oral training, you name it, we've got it. If you're interested in doing a bit more musical analysis, because we've just started to unpack that Haydn string quartet there, have a look at our analysis courses. We've got an analysis, for example, of all of Beethoven's Pathetique piano sonata. We've got another analysis of one of Bach's 48 preludes and fugues that really go into detail on those pieces and show you exactly what's going on in the pieces, what the composers were thinking, what's going on with the melodies, what's going on with the chords, what rhythmic ideas are being used, how the pieces are structured, how there's lots of variety in the texture. So it will really give you an insight into how those pieces are put together, give you some tools for analysis, give you some ideas for composition, give you some ideas as to how to look at a piece of music and see how a composer's put it together so that you can develop a really good interpretation of a piece that you're playing. So really useful to develop your analysis skills by looking at that course. While you're on the homepage, just click on Maestros. That's our international musical community, and you can discover what all that's about, and you can easily sign up as a member and join other people all over the world who are engaged in trying to further their knowledge and understanding of music, and lots of exciting opportunities to come together there. Anyway, it's all on that website. Have a look and see what's going to help you move on in the next step of your exciting musical journey. www.mmcourses.co.uk.